My name is Thomas Mitchell, and I'm 73 years old. For 42 years I've carried a secret that could destroy everything you think you know about what lives in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. I've kept silent through decades of ridicule, through government threats, through sleepless nights wondering if I was losing my mind. But now as I sit in this cabin in the remote mountains of Washington state, with my hands shaking from age and fear, I know I have to tell this story before they find me, before it's too late. What I'm about to reveal will change your understanding of intelligence, of family, of what it means to be human. The federal government has spent millions trying to bury this truth, but I won't take it to my grave. Before that, I continue. Subscribe to the channel and comment down below where you're watching from. It was October 1982 when my life changed forever. I was 31 then, working as a forest ranger in the Olympic National Forest, stationed at a remote outpost near the Hoh River. The assignment was perfect for someone like me, a loner who preferred the company of Douglas firs to people, who found peace in the endless green cathedral of the temperate rainforest. My cabin sat on a ridge overlooking the valley, surrounded by trees so massive they seemed to hold up the sky itself. The nearest town, Forks, was 40 miles away down a logging road that turned to mud soup every time it rained, which in that part of Washington was about 300 days a year. I'd grown up in these woods. My father had been a logger before the environmental regulations tightened, and he'd taught me to read the forest like other kids learned to read books. I could tell you what animals had passed by the broken twigs, could predict weather changes by the way the moss grew on the north side of the cedars, could navigate by starlight through terrain that would swallow a city person whole. The isolation never bothered me. After my divorce 2 years earlier, Sarah couldn't handle the loneliness, couldn't understand why I needed the silence. I'd thrown myself deeper into the work. My job was to monitor wildlife populations, maintain trails, and watch for signs of illegal logging or poaching. Most days I wouldn't see another human being. The morning it happened, a thick fog had rolled in from the Pacific, turning the forest into a ghostly maze of half-visible shapes. The air was heavy with moisture, and the rich smell of decomposing leaves, that earthy perfume that only exists in old-growth rainforest. I was checking a series of motion-activated cameras I'd set up to monitor elk migration patterns when I heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't animal either. A low, mournful wailing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the canyon walls like the cry of something lost and desperate. I followed the sound for nearly an hour, my boots squelching through the soggy undergrowth, pushing through walls of sword ferns and salmonberry bushes. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead, but that sound kept pulling me forward like a rope around my chest. When I finally found the source, my rational mind simply refused to process what I was seeing. She was crouched beside a fallen log, her massive frame hunched over something small and still. At first glance she looked like a bear, but bears don't have shoulders that broad, don't have arms that long, don't make sounds like that. She was covered in dark brown hair, coarse and thick, with patches of grey around her face that suggested age. Her hands, and they were hands, not paws, with long fingers and opposable thumbs, were gently cradling what I realized was a baby that wasn't moving. The smell hit me then, musky and wild, but not unpleasant, like wet dog mixed with cedar and something else I couldn't identify. She was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, even crouched down, with a barrel chest and muscles that rippled under her fur. But it was her face that stopped my heart. Beneath the heavy brow ridge and the flat nose, her eyes were unmistakably intelligent, unmistakably sad. She was mourning. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a broken branch under my foot, because she looked up at me. For a moment that lasted forever, we stared at each other across that misty clearing. I expected her to charge, to roar, to disappear into the forest like smoke. Instead, she did something that changed everything. She spoke, not in words, but in a sound that was clearly communication, a low rumbling vocalization that rose and fell like a question. Her head tilted slightly, and I realized she was asking for help. The baby, her baby, was barely breathing. It was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 3 feet tall, covered in lighter brown fur that looked soft as down. Its chest rose and fell in quick, shallow gasps, and even from 20 feet away I could see it was dying. Pneumonia, maybe, or some kind of infection. In the wild, death comes quickly to the young and weak. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to back away slowly, to pretend this had never happened, to file a report about unusual wildlife activity and let someone else deal with it. Instead, I found myself stepping forward, my hands raised in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "It's okay," I whispered, though my voice came out as barely a croak. "I want to help." She watched me approach with those dark, intelligent eyes, her massive body tense but not threatening. When I was close enough to touch her, she gently lifted the baby and held it out to me. The trust in that gesture nearly brought me to my knees. Here was a creature that should have been a myth, a legend told around campfires, and she was asking me, a human, a member of the species that had driven her kind to the edges of existence, to save her child. The baby was burning with fever, its breathing labored and wet. I'd had some medical training in the ranges, enough to recognize the signs of severe respiratory infection. Without antibiotics, it would be dead within hours. I looked up at the mother, saw the desperate hope in her eyes, and made a decision that would define the rest of my life. "I can help," I said, "but you have to trust me. You have to come with me." What followed was the most surreal hour of my life. I led them back to my cabin, this 8-foot-tall creature and her dying baby, through the fog-shrouded forest. She moved with surprising grace for something so large, her feet finding purchase on the slippery ground with the sure-footedness of something born to these woods. Every few minutes she would make that questioning sound, and I would reassure her as best I could, talking to her like I would to a frightened animal, though I was beginning to understand she was far more than that. My cabin was small, just 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a stone fireplace, but it was warm and dry. I cleared everything off my kitchen table and gestured for her to lay the baby down. She hesitated at the threshold, clearly uncomfortable with the enclosed space, but her maternal instincts won out. She ducked through the doorway, her shoulders barely fitting, and gently placed her child on the table. I had a small supply of veterinary antibiotics, part of my ranger kit for treating injured wildlife, and I prayed they would work on whatever physiology this creature possessed. The baby's breathing was getting worse, a wet rattle that spoke of fluid in the lungs. I prepared a syringe with what I hoped was an appropriate dose, looked up at the mother for permission, and when she nodded, actually nodded, I administered the injection. For the next 6 hours, I fought for that baby's life while its mother watched from the corner of my cabin, too large for any of my furniture, her eyes never leaving her child. I used every trick I knew: steam inhalation, chest percussion, fever reduction. The mother helped in ways that amazed me, holding the baby steady during treatments, somehow understanding what I was trying to do. As the sun set and the fog finally lifted, the baby's breathing began to ease. The fever broke around midnight, and by dawn it was sitting up, looking around with bright, curious eyes. The mother made a sound I can only describe as a purr of relief, and when she looked at me, I saw something that would haunt me for the rest of my life: gratitude. Pure, unmistakable gratitude from an intelligence as complex as my own. They stayed for 3 days, while the baby recovered its strength. During that time, I learned things about these creatures that science would kill to know. The mother, I started calling her Sage because of the wisdom in her eyes, was incredibly intelligent. She understood cause and effect, could solve simple problems, and had a vocabulary of sounds that was clearly a form of language. She was gentle with her baby, patient with my clumsy attempts to help, and showed a level of emotional sophistication that rivaled any human I'd known. But it was on the 3rd night that I realized the true scope of what I'd gotten myself into. I was awakened by a sound outside my cabin, not one voice but many. I looked out my window and saw them, a family group of at least 6 adults standing in the clearing around my cabin. They'd come for Sage and her baby. I expected them to simply take their family members and disappear into the forest. Instead, the largest male, clearly the patriarch of the group, approached my door. When I opened it, he looked down at me with eyes that held depths I'm still trying to understand. He made a series of complex vocalizations, and Sage responded from inside the cabin. They were talking about me. What happened next changed everything. The patriarch reached into a pouch made of woven plant fibers. These creatures used tools, made things, and pulled out a small carved stone. He placed it in my palm, and I felt the weight of ceremony, of significance. Sage emerged from the cabin with her baby, now healthy and alert, and the entire family surrounded me. One by one, they each touched my shoulder, a gesture that felt like both blessing and burden. They were marking me, claiming me, making me part of something I didn't understand. As they melted back into the forest, Sage was the last to leave. She turned back once, made a sound that I somehow knew meant thank you, and then she was gone, leaving me alone with a carved stone and the knowledge that my life would never be the same. That was the beginning. Over the next 40 years, I would learn that I hadn't just saved a baby's life, I'd been adopted into a family that existed in the spaces between human knowledge and human fear. They called themselves something that translates roughly to the hidden people, and they had been watching us, learning from us, avoiding us for centuries. Sage returned 2 weeks later, alone this time, carrying gifts, perfectly preserved salmon, medicinal plants I'd never seen before, and something that made my blood run cold. A piece of military equipment, a GPS tracker, the kind used by special forces units. She placed it on my table and made a sound that was unmistakably a warning. They were being hunted. Over the following months, I learned the scope of the threat. The federal government had been tracking these creatures for decades, using everything from satellite imagery to ground-penetrating radar to hunt them down. There were rumors of captures, of experiments, of creatures that had simply vanished from their family groups. The hidden people had developed an elaborate network of safe houses and escape routes, but the net was closing. Sage began visiting regularly, always at night, always alone. She would bring news of her people, warnings of government activity in the area, and slowly, patiently, she began to teach me her language. It was unlike anything human linguists had theorized, a complex system of tonal vocalizations, body language, and even scent markers that could convey incredibly sophisticated concepts. Through her, I learned about their society. They lived in extended family groups, each led by an elder council. They had oral histories that went back thousands of years, stories of the time before humans, of the great ice, of the slow retreat into smaller and smaller pockets of wilderness. They were vegetarian by choice, not biology, having made a collective decision centuries ago that taking life unnecessarily was wrong. They had medicine, art, philosophy, and a spiritual system that viewed the forest as a living entity, deserving of respect. They were, in every way that mattered, people. But they were people living under a death sentence. The government's interest wasn't scientific, it was military. These creatures were stronger than any human, could move through terrain that would stop a tank, had senses that put our best technology to shame, and possessed an intelligence that could be weaponized. The few that had been captured had been subjected to experiments that Sage could only describe through sounds of pain and horror. By 1985, I had become their unofficial liaison to the human world. I would warn them of helicopter activity, of unusual government presence in the forest, of hunting parties that seemed too well equipped to be civilian. In return, they shared their knowledge with me, not just of the forest, but of things that challenged everything I thought I knew about consciousness, about intelligence, about what it means to be alive. The baby I'd saved, Sage named him Hope, grew into a curious, playful youngster who would sometimes accompany his mother on her visits. Watching him learn, seeing the way he interacted with the world, was like observing the childhood of a genius. He could solve puzzles that would challenge adult humans, could mimic sounds with perfect accuracy, and showed an artistic sensibility that expressed itself in intricate patterns he would weave from grass and flowers. But it was Hope who would ultimately put us all in danger. In 1987, when he was about 5 years old in their terms of development, Hope made a mistake that nearly cost all of us our lives. He'd been playing near the edge of their territory when he encountered a group of hikers. Instead of hiding as he'd been taught, his curiosity got the better of him. He followed them for miles, staying just out of sight, fascinated by their equipment and behavior. One of the hikers was a wildlife photographer with high-end camera equipment. He managed to get 3 clear shots of Hope before the young creature realized he'd been seen and fled. Within a week, those photos were in the hands of federal agents, and the forest was swarming with black helicopters and men in unmarked vehicles. The hunt was on. Sage came to me in the middle of the night, more frightened than I'd ever seen her. The entire hidden people community was in chaos. Families were scattering, heading for remote areas deeper in the mountains, but the government had resources they'd never faced before. Thermal imaging, motion sensors, tracking dogs bred specifically for this purpose. Nowhere was safe. That's when I made the second decision that would define my life. I offered to hide them. My ranger station had been built during World War II as a fire lookout, and it included a network of underground bunkers and tunnels that had been forgotten by everyone except the maintenance records. Over the next month, working only at night, I helped convert those spaces into a hidden refuge. It wasn't comfortable. The creatures were too large for spaces designed for humans, but it was invisible to thermal imaging and sound detection equipment. For 3 months, I harbored a family of 7 hidden people in those tunnels. Sage, Hope, the patriarch I'd come to know as Elderstone, and 4 others. I brought them food, water, medical supplies, and news of the search above ground. The government had established a perimeter around a 50-square-mile area, and they were systematically combing through it with equipment that seemed almost science-fictional. Living in such close quarters, I learned more about their culture than any anthropologist could dream of. They had a complex social structure, based on consensus rather than hierarchy. Decisions were made through a process that involved everyone, even the youngest, and could take days of discussion. They had art forms that used sound, scent, and movement in ways that human senses could barely perceive. Their memory was eidetic. They could recall conversations, locations, and events with perfect clarity, going back generations. But most importantly, I learned about their capacity for love, the way they cared for each other, the gentleness they showed to Hope, despite the danger his curiosity had brought upon them, the way they worried about the other families scattered through the mountains. It was profoundly human and yet somehow more than human. Elderstone in particular became like a father to me. He was ancient by their standards, probably over 100 years old, and his knowledge of the forest was encyclopedic. He could predict weather patterns weeks in advance, knew the migration routes of every animal species, understood the complex relationships between plants and soil and water in ways that made human ecology look like finger painting. But beyond his knowledge, he had a wisdom that came from a lifetime of watching, of thinking, of trying to understand the place of his people in a world that was rapidly shrinking around them. It was Elder Stone who told me the true history of the hidden people, a story that would rewrite human understanding of evolution and intelligence. They weren't some missing link or evolutionary dead end. They were the original inhabitants of this continent, a species that had achieved consciousness and civilization long before humans crossed the land bridge from Asia. They had cities once, in the time before the ice, built into the living rock of mountain caves and hidden valleys. They had agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, and the understanding of genetics that allowed them to breed plants and animals for specific traits. But they had also learned something that humans never had: restraint. When they realized that their expansion was damaging the natural world they depended on, they made a collective decision to step back. They dismantled their cities, abandoned their agriculture, and chose to live in harmony with the forest rather than domination over it. It was a choice that saved the ecosystem, but doomed them to marginalization when a more aggressive species, humans, arrived and began the process of expansion they had rejected. For thousands of years, they had watched human civilization make the same mistakes they had avoided, but on a scale that threatened not just the local environment, but the entire planet. They had tried to make contact several times throughout history. Elder Stone spoke of meetings with certain Native American tribes, of attempts to share knowledge with early European settlers, but each contact had ended in violence or betrayal. Eventually, they had made the decision to hide, to become myth and legend, to survive in the spaces humans couldn't or wouldn't occupy. But now even those spaces were disappearing. The government search lasted 6 months. They found evidence, footprints, hair samples, territorial markings, but they never found the hidden people themselves. The underground refuge I'd created worked perfectly, and when the search was finally called off, the creatures emerged to find their world forever changed. The forest was now under constant surveillance. Motion sensors disguised as rocks, cameras hidden in tree bark, listening devices that could pick up vocalizations from miles away. The government hadn't given up. They just changed tactics. Instead of a massive search, they were now playing a waiting game, confident that eventually the creatures would reveal themselves. It was then that Sage made a proposal that terrified me. She wanted to make formal contact with the human government. The idea was insane. Every previous contact had ended in disaster. But Sage argued that hiding was no longer sustainable. The surveillance technology was getting better every year, and it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. Better to make contact on their own terms, to try to negotiate some kind of coexistence, than to be hunted down like animals. Elder Stone disagreed violently. The debates that followed were unlike anything I'd witnessed. Hours of complex vocalizations, gestures, and what I can only describe as philosophical arguments about the nature of trust, survival, and hope. The community was split down the middle, and for the first time since I'd known them, the hidden people were facing internal conflict. The decision was made for them in the spring of 1988. Hope, now 6 and increasingly independent, was exploring near the edge of their territory when he stumbled into a government sensor grid. The alarms that went off could be heard for miles, and within minutes the forest was swarming with helicopters and armed personnel. Hope managed to escape, but barely, and the close call convinced even the most conservative members of the community that their time was running out. Sage came to me with a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. She wanted to surrender herself to the government, alone as a gesture of peaceful intent. She would allow herself to be captured, studied, questioned, in the hope that her cooperation would buy protection for the rest of her people. I argued against it for hours. I knew what the government was capable of, knew that their interest in these creatures was military, not scientific. But Sage had made up her mind, and Elder Stone, despite his reservations, supported her decision. It was, he said, the action of a true leader, to sacrifice herself for her people. The surrender was arranged through a series of coded messages I left at predetermined locations. On a foggy morning in June 1988, Sage walked out of the forest and into a clearing where a team of federal agents was waiting. I watched from a distance through binoculars, my heart breaking, as she raised her hands in a gesture of submission and allowed them to place restraints on her massive wrists. That was the last time I saw her for 15 years. What happened to Sage during those years is something I pieced together from classified documents I wasn't supposed to see, from conversations with government personnel who thought I was just another ranger, from the nightmares that began visiting me shortly after her capture. She was taken to a facility in Nevada, a place that doesn't exist on any official maps, where she was subjected to tests that pushed the boundaries of what could be called science. They studied her intelligence, her physical capabilities, her emotional responses. They tried to teach her English, to understand her language, to map the neural pathways that made her consciousness possible. They took tissue samples, blood samples, genetic material. They exposed her to various stimuli to test her reactions, her breaking point, her capacity for cooperation. And through it all, she maintained the dignity and grace that had first impressed me in that foggy clearing so many years before. According to the reports I eventually read, she never showed aggression toward her captors, never tried to escape, never stopped trying to communicate. She drew pictures of her family, of the forest, of the life she'd left behind. She learned enough English to ask about Hope, about Elderstone, about me. She was, the reports noted with clinical detachment, the most intelligent non-human subject they had ever studied. But intelligence, I learned, was exactly what made her dangerous to them. The problem with studying a creature as intelligent as Sage was that she was studying them right back. She learned their routines, their weaknesses, their fears. She understood the political pressures they were under, the military applications they were exploring, the moral compromises they were making, and slowly, patiently, she began to turn some of them. Dr. Sarah Chen was a linguist brought in to study Sage's communication abilities. Dr. Michael Rodriguez was a psychologist tasked with mapping her emotional responses. Agent David Kim was a security specialist responsible for containment protocols. One by one, through her gentle persistence and obvious intelligence, Sage convinced them that what they were doing was wrong. It started small: better food, more comfortable accommodations, longer periods outside her cell. But as these government employees spent more time with Sage, they began to see her not as a subject, but as a person. Dr. Chen started bringing her books. Dr. Rodriguez began treating their sessions as conversations rather than experiments. Agent Kim found himself apologizing for the restraints he was required to use. By 1995, Sage had effectively turned a significant portion of the facility staff into advocates for her release. But she wasn't interested in her own freedom. She was working towards something much more ambitious. She wanted official recognition of her people's rights, protection for their remaining territory, and an end to the hunting and surveillance that had driven them to the edge of extinction. The government's response was predictable. They transferred the sympathetic staff to other assignments and brought in new personnel with explicit instructions to maintain professional distance. But the damage was done. Word was spreading through certain channels about the intelligent creature being held in Nevada, and pressure was building for either disclosure or release. That's when they made the decision to bring me in. I was contacted in the fall of 1995 by Agent Patricia Walsh, a woman whose cold efficiency masked what I would later learn was a deep moral conflict about her work. She knew about my relationship with the hidden people. They'd been watching me for years, and she wanted me to help them with what she called the Sage problem. The offer was simple. I would be granted access to Sage, allowed to serve as a liaison between her and the government in exchange for information about the location and habits of the remaining hidden people. It was, she made clear, not really a request. I agreed, knowing it was the only way I would ever see Sage again, but I had no intention of betraying the trust Elder Stone and the others had placed in me. The facility where they held Sage was like something out of a science fiction nightmare. Underground levels accessible only by high-security elevators, corridors lined with cameras and sensors, the constant hum of air filtration systems designed to contain biological hazards. Sage's accommodation was a large cell designed to look like a natural environment, complete with artificial trees and a small stream, but the concrete walls and reinforced glass made its true nature obvious. When I saw her again after 7 years, I barely managed to keep my composure. She had aged in ways that went beyond the passage of time. Her fur was streaked with grey, her movements slower, her eyes holding a sadness that seemed to reach into my soul. But when she saw me, her face lit up with a joy that made every risk I'd taken worthwhile. We were allowed to meet for 2 hours 3 times a week, always under observation, always with recording equipment capturing every sound we made. But Sage was clever, and she had learned to communicate in ways the monitoring equipment couldn't detect. Through subtle gestures, through the positioning of her body, through variations in tone that sounded like casual conversation to human ears, she told me about her years in captivity, about the things she had learned, about the plan she had been developing. The government wanted to use her people as weapons. The military applications were obvious. Creatures with their strength, intelligence, and natural camouflage abilities could be the ultimate special forces unit. But Sage had convinced some of her captors that cooperation was impossible without trust, and trust required recognition of her people's rights as a sentient species. She had been working toward a formal first contact scenario, one that would acknowledge the hidden people as the indigenous inhabitants of the continent, with rights and protections under international law. It was an audacious plan, one that would require careful orchestration and support from outside the military-industrial complex that currently held her captive. That's where I came in. Over the next 3 years, I became the secret conduit between Sage and a network of sympathetic government employees, scientists, and legal experts who believed that the hidden people deserved better than captivity and experimentation. We worked carefully, slowly, building a case for recognition and protection while maintaining the fiction that I was cooperating with the government's intelligence-gathering efforts. The breakthrough came in 1998, when Dr. Chen managed to smuggle out video recordings of her conversations with Sage. The footage showed a creature of obvious intelligence discussing complex philosophical concepts, demonstrating problem-solving abilities that exceeded those of most humans, and expressing emotional depth that was undeniably real. When those recordings were leaked to certain media outlets and scientific journals, the public response was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, the government's secret was out. The existence of the hidden people could no longer be denied, and the ethical implications of their captivity became a matter of international debate. Environmental groups, indigenous rights organizations, and civil liberties advocates all rallied to Sage's cause, demanding her immediate release and protection for her people. The government's response was to accelerate their research, hoping to extract as much information as possible before public pressure forced them to change course. Sage was subjected to increasingly invasive procedures, and I could see the toll it was taking on her during our visits. She was dying, slowly but surely, from the stress and isolation of captivity. That's when I made the third decision that would define my life. I decided to help her escape. The plan was insanely complicated, involving sympathetic staff members, carefully timed power outages, and a network of safe houses stretching from Nevada back to the Pacific Northwest. But Sage had been studying the facility for 10 years, and she knew its weaknesses better than its designers. The escape happened on a moonless night in October 1999. Dr. Chen created a distraction in the main laboratory, while Agent Kim disabled the security cameras in Sage's section. I was waiting with a stolen vehicle in the facility's parking garage, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the guards could hear it. When Sage emerged from that elevator, moving with the silent grace that had first amazed me 17 years earlier, I felt a surge of hope that almost overwhelmed me. We drove through the night, switching vehicles twice, following back roads through the desert toward the mountains where her people were waiting. But freedom came with a price. The government's response to Sage's escape was swift and brutal. The entire Pacific Northwest was declared a national security zone, with military personnel authorized to shoot on sight any unidentified large mammals. The hidden people, who had been slowly emerging from hiding in response to the public support for their rights, were forced back into the deepest wilderness, hunted more intensively than ever before. Sage was reunited with her people in a hidden valley deep in the Cascade Mountains, but the joy of homecoming was tempered by the reality of their situation. Hope, now a young adult, had become a leader among the younger generation, advocating for more aggressive resistance to human encroachment. Elder Stone had died during Sage's captivity, his last words a warning about the dangers of trusting humans too completely. The community was smaller than it had been when I first met them. Disease, hunting, and habitat loss had reduced their numbers to fewer than 50 individuals scattered across the entire Pacific Northwest. They were facing extinction, and they knew it. Sage's years in captivity had changed her in ways that went beyond the physical. She had learned things about human nature that had shaken her faith in the possibility of coexistence. The government officials who had seemed sympathetic had ultimately been willing to sacrifice her for their careers. The scientists who had claimed to respect her intelligence had continued to treat her as a subject rather than a person. Even the media attention that had forced her release had focused more on the sensational aspects of her existence than on the rights of her people. But she had also learned about human capacity for change, for growth, for moral courage. Dr. Chen had risked her career to help her. Agent Kim had violated his oath to ensure her escape. I had spent years working to protect her people, despite the personal cost. The question that haunted all of us was whether these individual acts of conscience could overcome the institutional forces that saw the hidden people as either threats to be eliminated or resources to be exploited. The answer came in the form of a young documentary filmmaker named Rebecca Martinez, who had been following the story of the hidden people since the first leaked videos appeared. Rebecca was different from the other journalists who had covered the story. She wasn't interested in sensationalism or government conspiracies. She wanted to tell the story of the hidden people themselves, to give them a voice in the debate about their future. Through a series of intermediaries, Rebecca made contact with Sage and requested permission to document their way of life. It was a risky proposition. Any filming would reveal their location to government satellites, but Sage saw it as an opportunity to show the world who her people really were. The resulting documentary, The Hidden People, A Species on the Brink, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2001 and changed everything. For the first time, the public saw the hidden people not as monsters or myths, but as a family trying to survive in an increasingly hostile world. They saw Hope teaching younger members of the community, his intelligence and curiosity obvious in every interaction. They saw the elders sharing stories that preserved thousands of years of oral history. They saw the careful way they moved through the forest, taking only what they needed, leaving no trace of their passage. Most importantly, they saw Sage herself, speaking in careful English about her hopes for her people's future, about the possibility of coexistence, about the wisdom that comes from choosing harmony over dominance. The documentary won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature and sparked a global movement for the recognition and protection of the hidden people. Environmental groups, indigenous rights organizations, and even some government officials began calling for a formal treaty that would establish protected territories and legal rights for the surviving communities. But not everyone was pleased with this development. The military-industrial complex that had been studying the hidden people for decades saw the growing public support as a threat to their research programs. If the creatures were granted legal protections, the opportunities for weapons development would disappear. If their territories were officially recognized, the surveillance and hunting operations would have to end. Their response was to launch a disinformation campaign designed to discredit both the documentary and the hidden people themselves. Fake experts appeared on television claiming that the creatures were dangerous, that they carried diseases that could wipe out human populations, that they were planning coordinated attacks on human settlements. Government officials who had previously remained silent began speaking about national security threats and the need for continued monitoring. The campaign was effective. Public opinion began to shift, and the political momentum for protection began to stall. Worse, the increased media attention made it impossible for the hidden people to remain hidden. Government satellites could now track their movements, and military units were deployed to monitor their activities. It was during this period of increased pressure that tragedy struck the community. Hope, who had grown into a powerful advocate for his people's rights, was leading a group of younger hidden people on a foraging expedition when they were spotted by a military patrol. The soldiers, operating under shoot-on-sight orders, opened fire without warning. Hope was killed instantly, along with 2 others. The survivors managed to escape, but the message was clear. The government's patience with the hidden people's existence was at an end. Sage's grief at the loss of her son was devastating to witness. The creature who had maintained her dignity through years of captivity, who had worked tirelessly for peaceful coexistence, was broken by this senseless violence. For weeks she barely spoke, barely ate, barely moved from the spot where she had first held hope as a baby. But grief, I learned, can be transformed into determination. When Sage finally emerged from her mourning, she had made a decision that would define the final chapter of her people's story. If peaceful coexistence was impossible, if the government was determined to hunt them to extinction, then they would not go quietly into the night. The hidden people had always been pacifists, but they were not helpless. Their knowledge of the forest, their physical capabilities, their intelligence, all of these could be turned toward resistance rather than hiding. They began a campaign of sabotage against the surveillance equipment that tracked their movements, against the logging operations that destroyed their habitat, against the military installations that served as bases for hunting expeditions. It was a guerrilla war fought in the shadows of the forest, and the hidden people were winning. But victory came at a cost. Each act of resistance brought increased retaliation, and the community was forced to scatter into smaller and smaller groups to avoid detection. Families were separated. Elders died alone in hidden caves. Children grew up knowing only fear and flight. By 2010, fewer than 20 hidden people remained in the wild, and they were being hunted by military units equipped with technology that seemed almost supernatural in its effectiveness. Thermal imaging that could detect body heat through thick forest canopy, acoustic sensors that could identify their vocalizations from miles away, drones that could track their movements in real time. It was then that Sage made her final sacrifice. She came to me one last time in the winter of 2011, appearing at my cabin like a ghost from the past. She was old now, ancient by her people's standards, her fur white with age, her movements slow and painful. But her eyes still held the intelligence and determination that had first impressed me nearly 30 years before. She had a proposal that broke my heart. She wanted to surrender herself again, permanently this time, in exchange for a guarantee that the hunting of her people would stop. She would submit to whatever experiments the government wanted, would cooperate with whatever research they deemed necessary, if they would agree to leave the remaining hidden people alone. I argued against it just as I had in 1988, but I knew she had already made up her mind. The difference this time was that she had leverage. The years of resistance had shown the government that the hidden people could not be eliminated by force without massive public attention and international condemnation. A negotiated surrender, with appropriate media coverage, would allow both sides to claim victory. The agreement was signed in a secret ceremony in the spring of 2012. Sage would return to captivity, but this time as a voluntary research participant rather than a prisoner. In exchange, the remaining hidden people would be granted a small protected territory in the most remote part of the Olympic National Forest, with guarantees that they would not be hunted or harassed as long as they remained within its boundaries. It was not the recognition and protection Sage had originally hoped for, but it was survival. I was allowed to visit her once more before she returned to the facility in Nevada. We met in the same clearing where I had first encountered her and Hope all those years ago, and for a few hours we simply sat together in the silence of the forest, 2 old friends saying goodbye. She gave me a final gift before she left, a small carved stone, similar to the one her father had given me decades earlier. But this one bore the image of a tree, with roots that stretched deep into the earth and branches that reached toward the sky. It was, she told me, a symbol of hope, the belief that something planted in darkness could still grow toward the light. Sage died in captivity 3 years later, in 2015. The official cause of death was listed as organ failure due to advanced age, but I knew the truth. She had died of a broken heart, separated from her people, her forest, her home. The remaining hidden people honored her sacrifice by adhering strictly to the terms of the agreement. They retreated to their protected territory and disappeared from human awareness once again, becoming myths and legends just as they had been for centuries before I stumbled into that foggy clearing. But they were still there, still surviving, still hoping. I retired from the Forest Service in 2016, but I never left the mountains. I built a small cabin on the edge of the protected territory, close enough to serve as a guardian, far enough to maintain the fiction that I was just another old man living alone in the woods. For the past 8 years, I have been the unofficial liaison between the hidden people and the outside world, just as I was all those decades ago. I bring them news of the changing world, warnings of new threats, supplies they cannot obtain in the wilderness. In return, they share their stories with me, their memories of sage and hope and elder stone, their hopes for a future that seems increasingly uncertain. The world has changed dramatically since I first met Sage in 1982. Climate change is altering the forests they depend on, making their traditional food sources unreliable and forcing them to adapt to new conditions. Urban sprawl continues to encroach on their territory, bringing noise and pollution and human activity ever closer to their hidden valleys. New technologies make it increasingly difficult to remain undetected, even in the most remote wilderness areas. But perhaps most challenging of all, the younger generation of hidden people is struggling with the isolation imposed by the agreement Sage made. They see the connected world that humans inhabit, the global community that technology has made possible, and they wonder if the price of survival is too high, if it means eternal separation from the larger community of intelligent life on Earth. These are the questions that keep me awake at night, the dilemmas that have no easy answers. How do you preserve a culture while allowing it to evolve? How do you protect a people while giving them the freedom to choose their own destiny? How do you honor the sacrifice of those who came before while remaining open to the possibilities of the future? I am 73 years old now, and I know I don't have many years left to serve as a bridge between two worlds. The hidden people will need new allies, new advocates, new friends who understand the importance of their survival and the value of their wisdom. That's why I'm telling this story now. Despite the risks, despite the agreements I've signed, despite the threats I've received, the world needs to know that intelligence takes many forms, that consciousness is not limited to human experience, that we share this planet with beings whose wisdom and perspective could help us solve the challenges that threaten all life on Earth. The government will deny this story, of course. They will claim it's fiction, fantasy, the delusions of an old man living alone in the woods. They will point to the lack of physical evidence, the absence of peer-reviewed studies, the convenient deaths of key witnesses. They will do everything in their power to maintain the fiction that humans are alone in their intelligence, that we are the only species capable of consciousness, creativity, and moral reasoning. But I have seen the truth, lived with it for 42 years, and I will not take it to my grave. Somewhere in the mountains of Washington state, in a hidden valley protected by ancient trees and federal agreements, the last of the hidden people continue their quiet existence. They remember Sage's sacrifice, Hope's courage, Elder Stone's wisdom. They tend their gardens, raise their children, and preserve the stories that connect them to thousands of years of history. They are waiting, as they have always waited, for a time when the world might be ready to accept them as they are, not monsters or myths, but people, different from us in form but similar in all the ways that matter. Intelligent, emotional, creative beings with their own hopes and dreams and fears. They are waiting for us to grow up, to move beyond our fear of the other, to recognize that consciousness is a gift that comes in many forms, and that wisdom can emerge from the most unexpected places. They are waiting for us to be worthy of their trust. I may not live to see that day, but I believe it will come. I have to believe it, because the alternative, a world where fear and greed triumph over wonder and wisdom, is too terrible to contemplate. The carved stone Sage gave me sits on my desk as I write these words, its image of roots and branches, a reminder that hope can grow even in the darkest soil. Somewhere in the forest, her people continue the work she began, preserving their culture, protecting their children, and holding space for the possibility that someday, somehow, two species might learn to share this world in peace. That is their gift to us, and our responsibility to them. To prove that intelligence, regardless of its form, can choose cooperation over conflict, understanding over fear, love over hate. The story I've told you is true, every word of it. I have the scars, the memories, and the carved stones to prove it. But more than that, I have the certainty that comes from 42 years of friendship with beings whose existence challenges everything we think we know about life, consciousness, and our place in the universe. If you choose to believe this story, if you choose to look beyond the official denials and government cover-ups, you might find yourself asking what you can do to help. The answer is simple. Protect the wild places, support indigenous rights, question the narratives that divide us from the natural world and from each other. Remember that intelligence and consciousness are not human monopolies, and that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources. And if you ever find yourself walking alone in an old-growth forest, if you hear sounds that don't quite fit the normal patterns of wildlife, if you catch a glimpse of something moving through the trees with too much intelligence and purpose to be an ordinary animal, remember this story. Remember Sage and Hope and Elder Stone. Remember that you might be witnessing something miraculous, something that deserves protection rather than exploitation, understanding rather than fear. The hidden people are still out there, still hoping, still waiting for a world that might be ready to accept them. Whether that day ever comes depends on all of us, on the choices we make about how we treat the other intelligences that share this planet with us. I've done what I can to protect them, to honor the trust they placed in me, to preserve their story for future generations. Now it's up to you to decide what comes next. The forest is listening. The hidden people are watching. And somewhere in the mountains of Washington State, in a valley protected by ancient agreements and older wisdom, the last representatives of Earth's first intelligent species continue their quiet vigil, holding space for the possibility that consciousness in all its forms might yet learn to live in harmony. That is their gift to us. That is their challenge to us. That is their hope for us. Don't let them wait in vain. If you made it this far, leave a comment and subscribe. It helps stories like this continue to be told.